What would you do if someone was waiting for his family for the rest of his life? A train station security guard tries to kick out an elderly man, but soon realizes that the man in front of him is more than just a guest. Find out how it changed his life. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. Henry arrived at the train station early in the morning, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the letter that had occupied his thoughts for days. The letter was old, worn at the edges, as if it had traveled a long way and through many hands before finally reaching him. It wasn't just any letter. It was from his son, a man Henry hadn't seen or heard from in decades. The paper had yellowed over time, but the words were as clear as the day they had been written. "I want to see you, Dad. Meet me at the station. I'll be waiting." There was no date on the letter, and it had arrived with no explanation of the delay. But that didn't matter now. Henry was here, and in his heart he clung to the hope that his son would show up any moment. The station buzzed with life. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases, the click-clack of their wheels echoing off the tiled floors. Announcements of arrivals and departures echoed over the intercom in a monotone voice. The clattering of train tracks reverberated through the air as trains pulled into the station, and the low hum of conversation filled every corner. The morning was cold, but Henry barely noticed. His focus was on finding a place where he could sit and wait. The large hall was filled with wooden benches, most of them already occupied by people either engrossed in their phones or flipping through newspapers. Henry spotted an empty space near the edge of one bench and made his way over, his legs feeling heavier than usual, though his heart was light with expectation. He took a seat, carefully folding the letter and slipping it into the inner pocket of his well-worn coat. His clothes were simple, faded by time, an old brown overcoat, a wool cap pulled low over his ears, and scuffed shoes that had seen better days. Despite his modest appearance, Henry held himself with quiet dignity. He was a man with a purpose today, and nothing, not even the years that had passed, could dampen the hope in his chest. As he sat there, Henry allowed his mind to wander back to a time long ago. He pictured his son as he had last seen him, just a boy, no more than 12 or 13, full of life and promise. He remembered the way his son's laughter used to fill their small home, the way he would run through the house, leaving a trail of energy in his wake. Those were good days, but they had ended far too soon. Life had pulled them apart in ways Henry could barely understand even now. A job lost, a home moved, and eventually a family divided. Henry's heart ached with the weight of all the years of silence, but he told himself that today could be the day that healed it all. He scanned the faces of the people passing by, looking for any hint of recognition. Would his son recognize him? So many years had passed. Henry's hair had turned silver, and his back was not as straight as it once was. Time had carved lines into his face, and his hands were no longer as steady as they once were. But a father always knows his child, and in his heart, Henry was certain he would recognize his son the moment he saw him. As the minutes turned into hours, the station continued to fill with people coming and going. Henry sat, his eyes never leaving the crowd, watching for any sign that his son had arrived. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten breakfast, but food was the last thing on his mind. The world around him seemed to blur as his thoughts fixated on the reunion he had dreamed of for so long. It was mid-morning when Henry first noticed the security guard watching him. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a navy blue uniform that looked a bit too stiff, as though he took his job very seriously. His name tag read Jim. Henry hadn't paid him much attention at first, but he could feel the man's gaze on him as he sat there, unmoving, waiting. Jim had been patrolling the station as usual, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious or out of place. His job was mostly routine, directing lost passengers, occasionally dealing with unruly travelers, and ensuring that no one overstayed their welcome. When he spotted Henry sitting alone on the bench, he immediately pegged him as a possible problem. To Jim, Henry looked like one of the many homeless people who occasionally wandered into the station to escape the cold. After a while, Jim approached Henry, his boots clicking against the floor as he crossed the hall. He stood in front of the old man, arms crossed, his face set in a stern expression. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff, "how long you been sitting here?" Henry looked up, surprised by the sudden confrontation. I'm waiting for someone," he replied, his voice steady but polite. Jim narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced. "You waiting for a train?" he asked, glancing around as if to verify Henry's story. "No," Henry said, shaking his head. "I'm waiting for my son. He should be here soon." The guard frowned, clearly unimpressed with the explanation. "This ain't no shelter. If you're not catching a train, you can't stay here all day." Henry felt a pang of frustration but kept his calm. "I understand. But my son, he asked me to meet him here. I have a letter from him." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded paper, holding it out for Jim to see. Jim didn't take the letter. He barely glanced at it before looking back at Henry. "Look, you can't just sit here if you're not buying a ticket or catching a train. We got rules. You can wait outside if you want, but you can't stay here all day." Henry's grip tightened on the letter, but he said nothing. He didn't want to cause trouble, especially not now, not when his son could walk through the door at any moment. "I'll move," he said quietly, "but I won't leave. My son, he's coming. I know he is." Jim sighed, clearly annoyed. "Do what you gotta do, but don't cause any problems. If I see you loitering round here all day, I'll have to ask you to leave." With that, the guard turned and walked away, shaking his head as he went. Henry watched him go, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger welling up inside. He had no intention of leaving. His son had written him a letter asking him to meet here, and that's exactly what he was going to do, even if it took all day, or all week. As the hours dragged on, Henry's hope began to waver, but he refused to give up. He stood and stretched his legs, walking slowly to the entrance of the station to get a better view of the crowds coming in. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. Every face that passed by was scrutinized, every tall figure was considered, every young man was a possibility, but none of them were his son. By the late afternoon, Henry returned to his bench. He sat, clutching the letter, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had waited so long. What were a few more hours? He would wait as long as it took. Jim passed by him again, giving him a disapproving look, but didn't say anything this time. Henry met his gaze for a moment before looking away. He knew what Jim thought of him. It wasn't the first time he had been mistaken for a homeless man or a vagrant, but Jim didn't know his story, and Henry didn't owe him an explanation. As evening fell, the station began to quiet down. The bustling crowds thinned out, and the noise of the day gave way to the softer hum of late-night travelers. Henry remained on his bench, his body stiff from sitting so long, but his mind was still sharp, still focused on the moment when his son would walk through the doors. And so he waited, alone in the dimming light of the station, clinging to the hope that had brought him here. The next morning, Henry was still at the station. He had spent the night on the hard bench, barely sleeping. The cold air of the station crept into his bones, but the exhaustion that weighed him down was no match for his determination. He had come here for a reason, and leaving wasn't an option. His son could walk through the doors at any moment. As the first rays of the morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the station, Henry stretched his stiff limbs and stood, rubbing his eyes. His back ached from sleeping in such an uncomfortable position, but he barely noticed. The letter was still in his pocket, a constant reminder of the reason he was here. He pulled it out and read it again, for what felt like the 100th time, his eyes tracing the faded words. They were a promise, one he believed in with all his heart. The station was coming back to life. People hurried in with coffee cups in hand, rushing to catch early trains. Announcements echoed through the hall, and the low hum of chatter filled the air. Henry watched the crowd, his heart skipping a beat every time a tall figure walked past. But none of them were his son. He sighed, his hope dimming slightly, but he forced himself to hold on. Today might be the day. A familiar figure appeared in the distance. Jim, the station guard who had given Henry a hard time the day before. Henry had noticed Jim patrolling the station throughout the previous day, his gaze often lingering on Henry as if expecting him to cause trouble. Now, as Jim approached, Henry prepared himself for another confrontation. Jim strode toward him with a sense of purpose, his boots clacking against the tiled floor. His uniform was still as stiff as it had been the day before, and his expression just as stern. He stopped a few feet away from Henry and crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You're still here," Jim said, his tone flat but with an edge of annoyance. Henry nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, I'm still waiting for my son." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Still waiting, huh? You said that yesterday." He glanced around the station as if looking for some justification to remove Henry from the premises. "How long are you planning on sticking around? This isn't a hotel, you know." Henry met his gaze steadily. "I'll stay as long as it takes. My son asked me to meet him here." Jim's eyes flicked to the old letter in Henry's hands, but he made no move to read it. "Look," he said, his tone growing more frustrated, "you can't just sit here forever. We've got rules. If you're not catching a train or buying a ticket, you can't hang around. People like you start causing problems." Henry frowned, but didn't rise to the insult. "People like me?" he asked quietly, his voice calm despite the offense. Jim didn't back down. "Yeah, you know what I mean. People who don't belong here. This is a place for travelers, not for loitering." Henry's shoulders stiffened, but he refused to let Jim's words get under his skin. He knew what the guard was implying, and it wasn't the first time in his life that he had been judged this way. His age, his race, and his worn-out clothes all worked against him in a place like this. But he had learned long ago not to let other people's prejudices define him. "I'm not loitering," Henry said firmly. "I'm waiting for my son. He wrote to me, and I'm going to be here when he comes." Jim rolled his eyes, clearly unconvinced. Sure. And what if he doesn't show up, huh? You just gonna sit here forever?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the letter in his hands, the fragile paper that had brought him here. "If that's what it takes," he said softly, almost to himself. "If that's what it takes." Jim let out a frustrated sigh and shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the station again. For a moment, he seemed to waver, as if unsure whether to push the issue or let it go, but his suspicion hadn't disappeared. He still saw Henry as a potential problem, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "Look," Jim said, his voice lowering as if he was trying to be reasonable, "I don't know what your story is, and frankly, I don't care, but you gotta understand, I've got a job to do here. I can't have people hanging around, especially when they're not supposed to be. It makes the place look bad." Henry met his gaze, a small spark of defiance in his eyes. "I understand you've got a job," he said, his voice steady, "but I've got a promise to keep. My son asked me to meet him here, and that's what I'm going to do, whether it takes a day, a week, or longer." Jim opened his mouth to argue, but something in Henry's tone gave him pause. There was no desperation in Henry's voice, no trace of the instability that Jim had expected from a man who looked like he'd been living on the streets. Instead, there was quiet determination, a resolve that Jim hadn't anticipated. It made him uncomfortable, as if he was confronting something he didn't fully understand. After a long silence, Jim finally spoke again, his voice softer, but still laced with suspicion. "You really think he's coming, don't you?" Henry nodded slowly, his eyes unwavering. "I know he is." Jim stood there for a moment longer, studying Henry as if trying to figure him out. Then, with a shake of his head, he turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Henry watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The encounter had left him shaken, not because of Jim's attitude, he was used to that, but because every passing hour without his son made it harder to hold on to hope. The day stretched on much like the previous one. Henry stayed on his bench, occasionally walking to the entrance of the station to scan the incoming crowds. His stomach grumbled from hunger, but he ignored it. Food didn't matter right now. The letter was his only focus. Every time a new train arrived, he perked up, his eyes searching for that familiar face, that long-lost connection. But as the hours ticked by, his son still didn't appear. By the afternoon, Henry was starting to feel the weight of his decision. His back ached, his legs were sore from sitting, and the hunger gnawed at him more persistently. But the idea of leaving, of giving up, was unthinkable. He had come too far. The years of separation, the silence, the wondering, all of it had led to this moment. He couldn't walk away now, not when there was still a chance, no matter how slim. Jim passed by several more times throughout the day, each time giving Henry a look that was a mixture of frustration and curiosity. He didn't speak again, but it was clear that he was keeping an eye on Henry, waiting for some excuse to remove him from the station. Henry pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the crowds, on the possibility of his son's arrival. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the station, Henry's resolve started to waver. The day had been long, and the cold was settling in once again. His body was tired, his mind even more so. He looked down at the letter, his fingers tracing the faded words, trying to draw strength from them. But doubt was creeping in, like a shadow at the edges of his thoughts. What if his son wasn't coming? What if the letter had been a mistake, a cruel twist of fate that had brought him here for nothing? The thought made his chest tighten with fear, but he pushed it away. He had to believe. He had to hold on to the hope that had carried him through so many lonely years. As darkness fell and the station quieted once again, Henry settled back onto his bench, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. He would stay. He would wait. And tomorrow perhaps would be the day his son finally came. By the time dawn broke the next morning, Henry was already awake, though he had barely slept. The previous 2 days had left him feeling more worn out than he cared to admit, but the idea of leaving the station without seeing his son was unbearable. The night had been colder than the last, and Henry's joints ached from sleeping on the hard bench. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff legs, and looked around the station. The early morning crowd had begun to trickle in. Business people with briefcases, young travelers with backpacks, and families holding the hands of sleepy children. As Henry scanned the faces of those entering the station, his heart sank a little more with each passing moment. His son was nowhere to be seen. Henry walked slowly to a nearby fountain, where he cupped his hands under the flow of water, letting it trickle over his palms before splashing it onto his face. The cold water helped shake off some of the weariness, but it did little to soothe the deeper exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the day before, but he ignored it. Food was a luxury that could wait. He would not leave the station, not until he knew for sure whether his son was coming. As he returned to his bench, Henry noticed Jim standing a short distance away, his eyes once again fixed on him. The guard was leaning against a pillar, arms crossed over his chest, watching Henry with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. It was clear that Jim didn't trust him. Henry could feel the weight of the man's suspicion with every passing glance. Jim had seen Henry spend 2 nights in the station now, and while he hadn't caused any trouble, his constant presence was starting to raise eyebrows. For Jim, Henry represented something that didn't belong, a disruption to the station's routine. But there was also something else, something that Jim couldn't quite place. Henry's quiet dignity, his refusal to leave, and the unwavering determination in his eyes made it difficult to dismiss him as just another transient. There was more to this old man than met the eye, and Jim was beginning to feel the tug of curiosity. Eventually, Jim pushed off the pillar and made his way over to where Henry sat. His steps were purposeful, but there was less of the aggression he had displayed the day before. Instead, there was a hint of hesitation, as if he wasn't sure how to approach the situation this time. "You're still here," Jim said as he came to a stop in front of Henry's bench. His voice was rough, but not quite as sharp as it had been in their previous encounters. Henry nodded, looking up at him with tired eyes. "I told you," he replied softly. "I'm waiting for my son." Jim shifted his weight, glancing around the station before focusing back on Henry. "You've been waiting a long time," he said. There was something different in his tone now, a flicker of something that almost resembled concern. Henry shrugged slightly, pulling his coat tighter around him to ward off the morning chill. "Time doesn't matter when you're waiting for someone you love." Jim frowned, not quite sure how to respond to that. He had never been good at talking about feelings, and the old man's words made him uncomfortable. Clearing his throat, Jim scratched at the back of his neck, trying to regain his usual sense of authority. "Look," he said, "I don't know what your story is, but you've got to understand. I can't let you stay here forever. People are starting to ask questions. If you're not catching a train, you need to move on." Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, weathered and worn from years of hard work. His fingers brushed against the letter tucked safely in his coat pocket, the fragile paper a constant reminder of the reason he was here. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just waiting." Jim sighed, feeling the tension between his duty and his growing unease about the situation. He couldn't quite bring himself to force Henry out, not yet. There was something about the old man's calm persistence that bothered him, but at the same time, it intrigued him. Why would someone like Henry, someone who looked like he had so little, cling so desperately to the idea of waiting for someone who might never come. Against his better judgment, Jim found himself sitting down on the bench next to Henry, a frown creasing his brow. "Look, man," he said after a moment of awkward silence, "I get that you're waiting for your son, but don't you think it's time to, I don't know, move on? He's not here. He hasn't shown up for days. What if he's not coming?" Henry looked at Jim, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "If I leave now," he said, "I'll never know if he came and missed me. I can't take that chance. I can't let him down again." Jim's frown deepened. "Again?" he echoed, latching on to the word. Henry sighed deeply, the sound heavy with the weight of years of regret. "We haven't seen each other in a long time," he admitted. "There were things that happened, mistakes I made. But this letter—" He paused, pulling the old letter out of his pocket and holding it out for Jim to see. "This letter is my second chance. I can't let it slip away." Jim glanced at the letter, but he didn't take it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, eyeing Henry with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "What's the story, then?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Why'd you lose touch with your son?" Henry hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he folded the letter back into his coat. It wasn't a story he liked to tell, but there was something about Jim's question that made him feel compelled to answer. Maybe it was the fact that Jim had finally sat down, that he was no longer barking orders or trying to throw him out. Or maybe it was just the weight of all the years Henry had spent in silence, keeping the pain of his past locked away. Either way, the words started to come, slow and hesitant at first, but gaining strength as Henry began to share his story. "We were close once," Henry said, his voice quiet but steady. "When he was a boy, we did everything together. I raised him on my own after his mother passed. It wasn't easy, but we made do. We had each other, and that was enough." Jim listened in silence, his arms still crossed, but there was no trace of the judgment that had marked their earlier conversations. He could see the pain in Henry's eyes, and despite himself, he felt a flicker of sympathy. "But then things changed," Henry continued. "I lost my job. We lost the house. And I couldn't give him the life he deserved. I was ashamed. I thought if I pushed him away, he'd be better off. So I left." Jim raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "You just left?" Henry nodded, his eyes cast downward. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. He tried to find me for a while, but eventually he gave up. And now, all these years later, I get this letter, asking me to meet him here." Jim stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just heard. It wasn't the story he had expected. He had pegged Henry as just another vagrant, someone with no direction, no purpose. But now, hearing this, Jim couldn't help but feel conflicted. Henry wasn't just some old man hanging around the station. He was a father trying to make up for lost time. And something about that stirred something deep inside Jim, though he didn't quite understand it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jim stood up, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice gruff. "Maybe you're right. Maybe your son is coming. But you can't stay here forever. Sooner or later, you've got to make a move." Henry looked up at him, his eyes full of quiet determination. "I've already made my move," he said simply. "Now, I just have to wait." Jim didn't respond. He just nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Henry alone on the bench once more. But as he walked, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. For the first time, he found himself wondering, what if Henry was telling the truth? What if his son really was coming? And for reasons Jim couldn't quite explain, he found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, Henry would get the reunion he was waiting for. The next morning, Henry remained on the bench, though the weight of the previous days had begun to take a toll. His body protested every movement, each muscle aching from the cold nights spent outside. But he refused to leave. The letter from his son was like a beacon in the darkness, one last spark of hope. He stared at it often, his rough hands gently unfolding and refolding the worn paper. Jim arrived at the station earlier than usual that day. Something about Henry's story had unsettled him the previous evening. He had spent much of the night lying awake, thinking about the old man waiting so desperately for someone who might never come. As a security guard, Jim had always believed in rules. People should be where they belonged, and if they didn't, they needed to move along. But Henry complicated things. He wasn't disruptive or dangerous, he was just waiting. And for reasons Jim didn't fully understand, that made it harder to dismiss him. As he patrolled the station, Jim found himself glancing toward Henry's bench again and again. The old man was sitting upright, though his body sagged with exhaustion. He wore the same overcoat, and his shoes were still frayed at the edges. Jim noticed that Henry hadn't eaten anything since he arrived. The vending machines were just a few steps away, but Henry made no move towards them. Jim knew the signs. He had seen it before. People who had nothing, trying to stretch out the few dollars they had for as long as possible. Jim sighed and walked over to the nearest kiosk. He bought a coffee and a sandwich, then headed toward Henry's bench. The old man looked up as Jim approached, his tired eyes meeting the guard's with quiet curiosity. "Here," Jim said, holding out the food. "You look like you could use it." Henry hesitated for a moment before taking the sandwich, his hands shaking slightly from hunger. "Thank you," he said quietly, unwrapping it with care as though it were a rare treasure. Jim sat down on the bench next to him, cradling his own coffee. "You need anything else?" he asked gruffly, as if embarrassed by the kindness. Henry shook his head, taking small, deliberate bites of the sandwich. "This is more than enough. I appreciate it." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the noise of the station bustling around them. It was a strangely comfortable silence, the kind that settles between two people who are slowly starting to understand each other. Jim glanced at the folded letter in Henry's hand. "That the letter from your son?" he asked. Henry nodded, brushing a finger over the edge of the paper. "It's the reason I'm here." Jim leaned back, sipping his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "You mind if I take a look at it?" Henry hesitated, but then handed the letter over. There was a trust developing between them, fragile but real. Jim unfolded the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The words were simple, just a son asking his father to meet him at the station, but something about it felt off. "When did you get this?" Jim asked, frowning. "Just a few days ago," Henry replied. "It showed up in the mail, no return address." Jim's brow furrowed as he read the letter again. "This paper, it's old." He tapped the edge of the page. "And the postmark looks ancient. You're telling me this just arrived?" Henry nodded slowly, a trace of confusion crossing his face. "Yes. Why?" Jim folded the letter and handed it back. "It looks like it's been sitting somewhere for years. Maybe it got lost in the system or something." The old man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty creeping into his expression. "But my son sent it. He asked me to meet him here." Jim shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of what he had to say next. Look, I'm not saying the letter isn't real, but if it's as old as it looks, then your son might not even know you got it." Henry's face fell, the weight of the possibility hitting him like a blow. He sat back, his hands trembling slightly as he refolded the letter and slipped it back into his coat pocket. "I hadn't thought of that," he whispered, more to himself than to Jim. I thought." Jim felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't trying to crush the old man's hope, but the truth was hard to ignore. The letter, with its yellowed paper and faded ink, was a relic from the past, one that might have arrived far too late. But still, there was something about Henry's story that wouldn't let Jim leave it alone, something that made him want to dig deeper. "I've got an idea," Jim said, standing up suddenly. "Wait here. I'll be right back." Henry nodded absently, his mind still reeling from the realization that his son might not even know he was waiting. Jim made his way to the small security office tucked away in the corner of the station. He sat down at the computer and began searching through public records, trying to find any trace of Henry's son. The name on the letter was all he had to go on, but it was a start. He typed it into the search bar, scanning through old newspaper articles, obituaries, and missing persons reports. After what felt like an eternity, he found something. A fleeting mention of Henry's son in an old community newsletter. According to the article, the son had been searching for his father for years, reaching out to shelters and social services in an attempt to find him. But there was no recent information, just a brief note that the search had been called off many years ago. Jim leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm one thing. Henry's son had tried to find him, and for some reason, that knowledge hit Jim harder than he expected. He printed out the article and headed back to the bench where Henry was waiting. The old man looked up as Jim approached, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "I found something," Jim said, handing over the printout. "It's not much, but it's a start." Henry took the paper and read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat alongside the letter. "He was looking for me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He never gave up." Jim sat down beside him, feeling a strange sense of relief. "Looks like you weren't the only one waiting." For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corners of Henry's mouth. It was a faint smile, weighed down by years of regret and longing, but it was real. "Thank you," Henry said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." Jim shrugged, his voice gruff as he replied, "Yeah, well, I guess I just don't like unfinished stories." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the discovery settling over them both. There was still a long way to go, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time since he arrived at the station, Henry felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. And Jim, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, felt it too. The atmosphere around the station felt heavier that evening. The bustling crowd was thinning, leaving the station quieter as late-night trains came and went. Henry and Jim remained seated on the same bench, their shared silence speaking louder than words. For Henry, the discovery that his son had been searching for him for years was both a bittersweet revelation and a crushing reminder of how much time had been lost. For Jim, something deeper was shifting. He was starting to see Henry as more than just an old man waiting in vain. As the hours passed, the cold evening air settled in, and the weight of reality became too much for Henry to bear. He stared down at the crumpled letter in his lap, his hands trembling slightly. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: hope clashing with fear, joy tangled with regret. He had come here full of certainty that his son would meet him, but now the uncertainty gnawed at him. Jim noticed Henry's distant expression and knew the old man was on the verge of breaking. His hands itched to help somehow, but words had never been his strong suit. Yet, something about Henry's quiet struggle stirred a strange sense of responsibility within him. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "You all right, Henry?" Jim asked, his voice softer than usual. Henry shook his head slowly, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. I don't know anymore," he whispered. "What if I've been wrong all this time? What if he's not coming?" The vulnerability in Henry's voice hit Jim harder than he expected. He had spent the last few days trying to push Henry away, treating him like a nuisance. But now, seeing the old man unraveling under the weight of his emotions, Jim felt a pang of guilt. "It's not your fault, you know," Jim said after a long pause. "You came here because you believed in something. That takes guts." Henry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Guts? No, it was foolishness. I left him all those years ago thinking I was doing the right thing. And now I've probably missed my chance to make it right." Jim's chest tightened at the raw honesty in Henry's words. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. But something inside him urged him not to let the moment pass. "Look, Henry, you can't change the past, but you're here now. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Henry's voice cracked as he replied, "What if it's not enough? What if he gave up on me, like I gave up on him?" The silence between them was thick with emotion, and Jim struggled to find the right words. He had spent most of his life building walls that kept people out, that kept emotions at bay. But those walls were beginning to crack, and Henry's story was seeping through the gaps. "Listen," Jim said, leaning forward. "I read that article. Your son tried to find you. He didn't give up. And maybe, just maybe, he hasn't given up yet." Henry's shoulders slumped, his resolve crumbling under the weight of years of guilt and regret. "But what if I can't make things right? What if it's too late?" Jim shook his head. "It's never too late, Henry. Not if you're willing to try." Henry looked at Jim, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jim hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. Why was he helping this old man? Why did he care? He wasn't sure if he had a clear answer, but the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "Because I think I need this as much as you do," Jim admitted quietly. Henry stared at him for a moment, his expression softening. It was a strange and unexpected connection. Two men from different worlds, each carrying their own burdens, somehow finding solace in each other's company. For the first time since arriving at the station, Henry felt the knot of fear in his chest begin to loosen. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone cared. Someone believed in him. Jim shifted in his seat, clearing his throat awkwardly. "All right," he said, trying to sound casual. "We've got two choices. We can sit here feeling sorry for ourselves, or we can figure out what to do next." Henry blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jim said, "we don't have to wait around here forever. We've got a starting point. Your son tried to find you, right? So let's follow that trail." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "You mean you'd help me?" Jim shrugged, trying to downplay the significance of the offer. "Yeah, why not? I've got some vacation time saved up. We'll track him down together." Henry felt a surge of emotion welling up inside him. gratitude, hope, and something that felt almost like joy. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could still be made right. He smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Jim," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jim gave a half smile in return, shifting awkwardly in his seat. "Don't mention it. Now, come on, let's figure out where to start." They sat together, talking quietly as the station buzzed with life around them. It wasn't much, a plan barely formed, a hope fragile and uncertain, but it was enough to keep them going. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he was moving forward instead of standing still. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't doing it alone. The following morning, Henry and Jim stood side by side at the station's exit, ready to embark on their search. The cold wind brushed against their faces, but for the first time, Henry didn't feel the chill. Instead, a strange sense of purpose filled him. He clutched the old letter in his coat pocket, not as a reminder of the past, but as a promise, a vow that he and Jim would follow this trail wherever it led. Jim, holding a small notepad filled with addresses and names he had found the night before, glanced at Henry. "Ready?" he asked. His tone was casual, but Henry could sense the shift in Jim's demeanor. This wasn't just a duty for the security guard anymore. It was personal. Henry gave a small nod. "As ready as I'll ever be." They started with the first address on Jim's list, a modest apartment complex where Henry's son was said to have lived years ago. The building, nestled between two larger, more modern structures, had aged just as Henry had. The paint was chipped, the bricks crumbling in places, but it had a quiet charm that suggested it had once been someone's home. Henry and Jim approached the front door, and after a few knocks, an older woman answered. She looked at them with a hint of suspicion, but when Henry mentioned his son's name, her face softened with recognition. "Oh, yes," she said, "I remember him. He lived here. Let's see, must have been about 10 years ago. Nice young man. Kept to himself mostly, but always polite." Henry's heart raced. "Do you know where he went? Where he might be now?" The woman shook her head sadly. "No, I'm afraid not. He left one day and didn't come back. I heard he was looking for his father, though. Asked around about him for months." Henry felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As they walked away from the apartment complex, Jim gave Henry a reassuring glance. "We're getting closer," he said. "We'll find him." Their next stop was a shelter listed in one of the articles Jim had found, a place where Henry's son had stayed briefly while searching for his father. When they arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity, volunteers handing out meals and sorting donations. A staff member greeted them at the entrance, her warm smile welcoming but tired. "Can I help you?" she asked. Henry cleared his throat. "I'm looking for my son. I heard he stayed here years ago." He gave her his son's name, and the woman's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I remember him," she said softly. "He was here for a short while. Spent a lot of time at the library researching. He said he was trying to find someone important. His father, I think." Henry clenched his hands, feeling the weight of those lost years pressing down on him. "Did he ever say if he found him?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "I don't know. One day, he just left. I always wondered if he found what he was looking for." Henry swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. The years lost, the missed chances, the moments that could never be reclaimed. But instead, he stood in silence, holding himself together with sheer will. Jim placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, steady and reassuring. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. "We've still got places to check." Their journey took them across the city, following faint leads and fragments of information. They visited cafes where Henry's son had once worked, bookstores where he had browsed for hours, and even parks where he had spent time alone, lost in thought. Everywhere they went, they found the same story, an echo of a man searching for something but always leaving before anyone knew if he had found it. Along the way, Henry and Jim's bond deepened. Their conversations became more personal, more open. Henry spoke about his regrets, about the life he had built and lost, about the nights spent wondering if his son was safe and happy. Jim, in turn, shared stories from his own life. His struggles with trust, his distant relationship with his own family, and the regrets that haunted him in the quiet moments between shifts at the station. They laughed together at small jokes, shared meals at diners along the way, and supported each other through the growing weight of the search. For Henry, it was the first time in years that he felt truly understood, truly seen. And for Jim, it was the first time he allowed himself to care about someone beyond the confines of his uniform. As the days passed, they followed every lead, no matter how small. And though each stop brought them closer to the truth, it also deepened Henry's fear. What if they found his son too late? What if all that remained were memories and missed opportunities? Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Henry and Jim sat on a bench in a quiet park, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Henry stared up at the sky, his heart heavy with both hope and dread. "I keep thinking," Henry whispered, "what if I'd never gotten that letter? What if it had been lost forever?" Jim looked over at him, his expression unreadable. "Then we wouldn't be here," he said simply, "and that would have been a damn shame." Henry smiled, a small but genuine smile. Despite the uncertainty, despite the fear, he was grateful for this journey, for the chance to make things right, even if it took a lifetime to do so. As the night grew colder, they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The journey was far from over, but they had come too far to turn back now. And together, they would face whatever lay ahead, because sometimes the only way to move forward was to take the first step with someone by your side. It was late afternoon when Henry and Jim finally arrived at the last address on their list, a modest suburban house with a small front yard and a mailbox leaning slightly to one side. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the distant sound of children playing and the hum of passing cars. Henry's heart pounded as they stood at the gate, staring at the home that might hold the key to his search. "This has to be it," Jim said quietly, glancing at the house. Henry nodded, but his throat felt too tight to speak. His hand trembled as he reached for the gate, but before he could open it, the front door creaked and a woman in her 50s stepped out onto the porch. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression cautious as she noticed the two men standing outside. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. Henry cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm looking for someone. My son. His name is—" Before he could finish, the woman's eyes softened and she gave a small, understanding smile. "You're his father," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We've been wondering if you'd ever come." Henry felt his knees weaken. "He's here?" The woman's smile faltered. "He's not here right now. He's at the hospital. He had surgery a few days ago. It's been a tough recovery." Henry's breath caught in his throat. The hospital. Is he? He's alive, the woman reassured him gently. But he's been asking for you. He never stopped hoping you'd find him. The weight of those words nearly brought Henry to his knees. He turned to Jim, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. Jim gave him a steady nod as if to say, "We've come this far. Let's see it through." They arrived at the hospital just as the sun was setting. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as they navigated through the white-tiled hallways. Nurses passed by with charts in hand, their soft voices and the occasional beep of monitors the only sounds breaking the quiet. When they reached the room, Henry hesitated outside the door. His heart thundered in his chest, a whirlwind of emotions, fear, hope, guilt, and relief, all tangled together. Jim placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Go on," he said softly. "He's been waiting." Henry swallowed hard and slowly opened the door. Inside the small hospital room, the soft hum of machines filled the air. There, lying on the bed, was Henry's son. His face was thinner than Henry remembered, and his skin was pale from the effects of surgery, but it was him. His son, the boy he had lost so long ago, was here, alive and within reach. Henry stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Son," he whispered. The man on the bed stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, but then recognition dawned, and his expression softened into something that made Henry's heart ache. "Dad?" his son whispered, his voice weak but filled with wonder. Henry collapsed into the chair by the bed, unable to hold back the tears that welled in his eyes. "I'm here," he said, gripping his son's hand tightly. "I'm so sorry. For everything. I should have been there. I should have never left." His son shook his head, squeezing Henry's hand with what little strength he had. "It doesn't matter now," he whispered. "You're here. That's all I ever wanted." The words hit Henry like a wave, washing away the years of regret and guilt. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaken with silent sobs. For so long, he had believed he would never get this moment, never hear those words. But now, here they were, and they were more precious than anything he could have imagined. Jim stood quietly at the door, giving them their moment. His heart ached as he watched the reunion unfold, a father and son, separated by time and mistakes, finally finding their way back to each other. It was messy and imperfect, but it was real. And in that room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the warmth of forgiveness, Jim felt something shift within himself, too. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of healing. Henry stayed at the hospital, sitting by his son's side holding his hand, and talking about the years they had lost. They laughed at old memories, shared stories of the lives they had lived apart, and slowly began to bridge the gap that time had created. It wasn't easy. Some wounds ran deep, but they were both willing to try. And that was enough. Jim visited every day, bringing coffee for Henry and chatting with the nurses. He had never thought of himself as the kind of person to get involved in other people's lives, but something about Henry's journey had changed him. He no longer saw the world in the same rigid lines of right and wrong, black and white. Life was more complicated than that, and sometimes all people needed was a second chance. A week later, Henry's son was discharged from the hospital. They celebrated by visiting a nearby park, a place that held no memories, only the promise of new ones to be made. The three of them, Henry, his son, and Jim, sat together on a wooden bench under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The sun was warm on their faces, and the air was filled with the soft rustling of leaves. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams, making plans for the future. Henry's son leaned on his father for support, his strength slowly returning with each passing day. Jim sat beside them, feeling more at peace than he had in years. At one point, Henry's son looked at Jim and smiled. "Thank you," he said, "for helping my dad, for not giving up on him." Jim shrugged, his voice gruff as he replied, "He didn't give me much choice." They all laughed, the sound light and easy, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. It was a moment none of them would forget, a moment filled with hope, forgiveness, and the promise of new beginnings. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Henry leaned back on the bench, a contented smile on his face. He had spent so many years chasing the past, haunted by regrets. But now, sitting here with his son and his friend, he realized that the past didn't matter as much as he thought. What mattered was the present, the people he loved, the moments they shared, and the second chance life had given him. And, for the first time in a long time, Henry felt truly at peace. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next video. There's so much more to explore. Click on the next video to continue your journey with us. And while you're at it, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this from? Your thoughts matter, and we can't wait to hear from you.